Hello and welcome to the second of our conversations with Georgetown Global Dialogue Fellows. Today I'm speaking to our newest fellow, the distinguished writer Maria Stepanova. Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Pankaj. It's an honor.
Well, it's a great privilege for me. I mean, I think, I've been reading you from the time your work became available in English, and it was actually personally a great revelation for me, because I had been trying to follow Russian writing after 1901, and it's very odd, and perhaps we can talk about it later, the way in which this writing was received in the English language in the United States and the United Kingdom. Uh, it's very clear today that there was some very serious omissions, some very serious gaps. But anyway, I want to talk to you, Maria, in the beginning about, a little bit about your early life, because, you're one of those rare writers who, rare in the sense of having an experience of two very different socio-political, economic realities. One is, of course, as a young person in the Soviet Union, and then from the 90s in a new country altogether. Um, could you tell us a little bit about where you were born and where you went to college or school? And, what were your sort of earliest influences at that time? What were you reading? But anyway, I'm already asking too many questions.
Well, let's start with something. And thank you for making me think about it because for the last few years, I've been trying to revise or to rewind my early experiences, trying to make sense of the latest events, obviously, and the way with my country and I'd say the intellectual strata of contemporary Russia reached this point of a catastrophe. And to start with something, I was born in Moscow in 1972, and in a family of how to describe it. So the easiest way is to use the dated word intelligentsia. But intelligentsia, low key, not the elite circles of Moscow intellectuals, but the reading ones, technical intelligentsia, engineers, some people from the academia, but again, of the opposition that never declared itself as such. And
Yeah, I briefly lost you. I think the screen was frozen where you said academia.
aha. My apologies because I wonder what's going on. I'm just sitting. Okay, we'll see. So,
So they were
uh,
members of academia, you were saying.
yeah, some of them the members of the academia, but again, kind of low-key, engineering, practical architecture, never going too high. And they all were, well, diary writers or letter writers, but they never perceived themselves as someone having, well, agency in terms of defining themselves as an active part of the society, of the community. They were having, well, some anti-communist oppositional leanings, but again, they never joined the circles of dissidents. They were moving, well, on the periphery of these circles, knowing someone, exchanging letters with someone, but it never transformed into the position of well, of visibility, let's say. I'd even say that for a few generations from the beginning of the century, it was necessary to be invisible in order to survive. The more visible you were getting, the more was the risk you were putting your family into. And so they tried to be unnoticed, to pass under the radar. To give you an example, my mother, who was a serious reader in a reading family, which is to say a lot, she was born in 1941, so the first months of the Germany's aggression against the Soviet Union, in the evacuation because she was Jewish and the family had to leave Moscow. It was too dangerous. And when she was growing up, her ultimate ambition, her craving was to become a poet.
Mm.
And it was a no-go. And in the first time of in her life, her grandfather, who had another story that might be told, he absolutely forbade her from taking this direction. He said, but no, it is a no. It is not a profession. And you know that in your position, in your situation, with your ethnicity, because in Russia, being Jewish was not a matter of religion, it was an ethnic thing. You have to get a practical education. And so she went into some architectural college and was, spent her lifetime uh, exploring the, well, the ground and the way it is fit to experience external pressures, which I find highly metaphorical.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yeah. And your father?
And my father, that is another story, because with my family, everything was a result of the Russian Revolution, 1917, and I am an unwilling beneficiary of the events because I know well enough that my family members, my ancestors, were coming from a range of different backgrounds, ultimate poverty, serious wealth. And if not for the unbelievable and violent melange of all the social stratas during the revolution, they would never have met one another. But of course, along the way, there was a lot of prejudice. And my father's father he barely escaped the Big Terror in 1938, and he and at the brink of being arrested, he had managed to produce. Ah, now that's a dog. My apologies. Детка, хватит, хватит. Ко мне. Yeah. Yeah. So coming back to it. Um, uh, mm, it seems that my father was conceived in 1938 at the brink of my grandfather's arrest.
Wow.
And so we have, and mm, um, he was able to escape imprisonment or something worse because of a sure stroke of luck. And that memory was also an underground current that was always present. You knew that you're living in the circumstances or in the society that arranges things in a way that anything could happen to anyone. But simultaneously, in the 1970s, when I was born, things were much more, let's say, modest or much more mild. Everything was stratified, everything was predictable, and you had a set of rules that you were supposed to follow. And it was practically a guarantee that you'll be able to make a living if you were not striving for something, let's say, improper. And it is hard to describe the entire scope of impropriety because it could be anything. You could not, I was feeling it well enough as a schoolgirl, you could not be eccentric, for instance.
Interesting. Yeah.
You could not go over the top. You were supposed to behave in a very well defined and narrow stylistic space. And if you had trouble with that, you were in trouble for, I mean, for a long time. Your your perspectives were, well, questionable because mm, it was something that, well, to give you to give you that is that is interesting because I find it hard to describe. But whenever I meet a person from Eastern Europe, from the former Yugoslavia, from Bulgaria, from the Baltic state, a person with the same background, we start comparing not the historical facts, they are largely different. Not the way uh, well, culture was surviving because it was also largely different. In Poland, the dissident writers were able to publish their poetry. They were having books. In Russia, it was underground. You could not do anything. I mean, in the Soviet Union, the regimes were different, the approaches, the inner pacts. But the smells and the colors and a feeling of boredom. I would never be able to describe, but I was always trying to describe the Soviet blue or the Soviet green. That is unlike anything you see elsewhere. And the worst thing or the funniest thing is it is extremely good looking in cinematic terms. So a good director could make a masterpiece using these colors as a background. But if you're sentenced to spend your lifetime in this color and the smells, I mean, of rotting vegetables and and uh, and shoe polish and stale bread, rich enough, enough. Babe, just a sec.
Yeah.
Аля, это было очень зря. Sorry for that. Yeah. So the smells that are unmistakable, stale bread and rotting vegetables and shoe polish and something else. And sometimes I was in Poland once, and I entered the Polish Spar, which is pretty much the same everywhere. Modest German, quadratisch, praktisch gut. And I could not get away from there because I was standing there, and it was the smell of my childhood, my
I guess.
7 years old. If I could, if I could bottle the scent, I would do it.
That was your Proustian Madeline.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So there were sort of these I mean there was a sort of clear sense of what you could do, and also, as you say, a very kind of a mysterious scale of impropriety,
Mhm,
uh, where people could be punished for the small. And as you were speaking, I was thinking, yes, it's as late as 74.
mhm.
Solzhenitsyn was exiled. Brodsky was accused of, if I'm not mistaken, hooliganism.
No, worse than that,
Parasitism?
hooliganism. There was a specific word
Or not?
describing a person who refuses to work.
Yes. Parasitism, no?
Parasitism, exactly.
Parasite. Yeah,
So even more interesting.
yeah.
But of course, being a worker was a working person was extremely important.
Interesting. So when you went to, at what stage were you sort of fully aware that, of this kind of very strange history of the Soviet Union, a history in which your own family was involved. Right from, I mean, there's a scene in memory of your great grandmother mother demonstrating in 1905.
Mhm,
Um, and I was thinking, what an extraordinary convergence of, and the whole book is testament to that, of personal history with family history, with the larger social political history. Again, it's extremely unique in the 20th century for that kind of close convergence. And no, not surprisingly, your work is so preoccupied with the question of memory and how do we remember things. So I'm curious about, when did you first become aware, at school or early years in college, of this history to which you were connected, both familial at the level of your family, and of course at the level of the larger community, the ethnic community that you belong to, and also, the sort of larger national history that
mhm.
you were part of? Were
Uh,
these
mhm,
awarenesses simultaneous, or were they sequential? Um,
mhm, mhm, mhm. I would say that largely and primarily uh, uh, all the information I used to have was coming either directly from my parents or in a in a roundabout way from the household, because and it was a common practice in the Soviet times, things that people were not supposed to be talking about were transmitted in a non-verbal way. You were making your observations and conclusions, and some things were simply obvious. I was lucky uh, for a for a Soviet citizen and for a European, I would say, to have an enormous family archive. The letters, the postcards, the photographs, the portraits, and also some memorabilia that that represented a different world that had nothing in common with the world I was experiencing with my own five senses. So there was the normal world I was inhabiting with school and pioneer camps and pioneer songs and marches and the celebrations of the 1st of May and the 7th of November and some modest non-official holidays like the New Year. Um, and simultaneously, and only in my own households, and maybe in a number of households that belonged to my family friends. There were some remnants of a former life, and just a few of them, but they were talking to me in a language that I did not know, but it was captivating. And it was clear that you have these two worlds, the before and the after, and the things that made sense in the world of before are have no practical use in my everyday life. Uh, and well, you know that my great grandmother was a revolutionary, but still, among her things, there was a black felt hat with ostrich feathers and ball gloves. I don't know if she was using them, but she owned them. And
She in the same photo with Yakov Svertlov. Um,
yes,
that's fantastic. I reread that book, and first time I'd not noticed that, but this time I was really truly amazed.
yeah, and she was a close, intimate friend of his younger sister. So they stayed, well, comrades until the late 60s, early 70s. So she was deeply connected this family, and she knew Lenin's wife, maybe not that close, but still. And it makes it it makes even more striking the fact that knowing all those people, after she came back from the emigration and she was forced to leave the country at 1907, and she returned uh, with the beginning of the First World War in 1914. And she lived in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and forever since. And she never tried to come back to the revolutionary circles of her younger years. She was keeping the contacts on a personal level, but she never tried to make a career or something. And maybe that helped her to survive because the majority of her pals had perished in the beginning of the 1930s.
Yeah, yeah. So you were able to access this sort of other reality,
Mhm.
as it were, because of this family archive of letters and photographs. Um, and were you then aware of a very sharp sort of division between that world and the world you were living in, or was it just these worlds were coexisting for a while at least?
Mm, they were mutually exclusive,
Interesting. Yeah.
and it was absolutely clear I had no use to the knowledge or to the object. Well, for instance, the visiting cards with the gold gilded edges that belonged to some members of my family, and they survived over 70 years. But, I mean, what is the use in a Soviet society? I mean, if you are meeting someone, you're giving him a handshake, right? And if you want to give your telephone number, you can dictate it. What is the point? What is the use of these pieces of cardboard? But they were beautiful. And the concepts of useless beauty was entirely out of place. Everything was supposed to be useful in many different and distinctive ways. So I'd say that my childhood was an exercise in nostalgia. I did not know the term, but I knew that I would love to go back, at least for a while, to encounter and experience that different world, that different order. And I suppose that the contemporary 20 or 30 year olds might feel the same about the Soviet era, of course, because they were, I mean, when they see the colors and the smells, the sensations are not forced upon them. And so it is easy to romanticize the past. And if I had to name my objections against the cult of memory that is becoming so overwhelming nowadays. And I've been devoted, let's say, devoted participant. But memory is always any kind of memory is an experiment in forgetting. You're closing your eyes on certain details that do not adjust to the picture you want to see.
Yeah.
And that
It's
is.
interesting. I hadn't read your introduction to Hope Against Hope,
Mhm,
and I read it today, and I was thinking, actually, I didn't know quite a few things about, well, the recent discoveries that Stalin
mhm,
hadn't actually read the poem
mhm.
that Mandelstam thought had got him into trouble.
It is
Uh,
awfully disappointing, isn't it?
it's disappointing because, like, there are entire libraries of books devoted to the subject, and most of us have grown up thinking this is what happened.
Mhm,
Um, but what I was also interested in was his widow's attempt to reframe the past, the whole process of correction and revision that goes on in those two books, which obviously a lot of people objected to. Um,
mhm,
but that it's like this is a concern that can have benign. Obviously, this is something that can have benign manifestations um, in terms of just a writer, uh, I suppose, redrawing the past a bit. But I think the attempt to present the past as a seamless whole,
mhm,
present the past as something that aspects of which can be recovered, and recovered collectively. That really is a dangerous mode of politics that, as you point out, not just Russia, but many, many different societies around the world are now engaged in. What's it really interesting is that this should happen in Russia first,
mhm,
Russia and I suppose the Balkans, more or
mhm.
less simultaneously.
Yeah, and interesting that I mean, both the Balkans and the Russians were, let's say, easy victim or easy target for this virus of memory wars, because I mean, when you think about Germany, for instance, everything is so clean and seamless because you have the perpetrators, you have the victims, you have the bystanders, uh, and I mean, that's it. You don't have this turning, moving wheel of blame and guilt and shame and so on and so forth, because both in Russia and at the Balkans, you had to live your life big, well, not necessarily, well, it did not happen to everyone, of course, but a good part of the population had and used the chance to become, well, the perpetrator, the bystander, and then eventually the victim, and maybe even to make the same circle again. So everything is relative, and there's such a number of people feel feel it necessary to rewrite the general history because they need to correct their family history.
Mm. Yeah,
But I mean, look at well, everything. The U.S. And the way history is being revised this way and back again, this pendulum like movement that never seems to be stopping upon something, some point of a general consensus, which should be a, well, result of
exactly.
history.
Yeah.
Mhm,
I'm sort of curious about how you see the role of the writer and all this. I mean, you've written about this in many different contexts. But one thing that seems almost necessary for a writer is, of course, some degree of political stability. And that is at least the assumption that most, writers have worked with in recent decades.
mhm,
Um, but it is the case that there are now increasing number of writers in exile, living in exile, living with the possibility they might not ever be able to return to the societies they left behind them, to the languages or the literary traditions that have flourished in one particular territory. Um, and I think, I mean, this obsession with the past at the same time. I've been sort of asking myself also with, with the Indian experience now, more and more resembling the experience of other societies of displacement, of dispossession, of permanent exile, of emigration, whether some kind of faith in the future as and a sort of national project that was oriented towards the future was perhaps a better place for a writer to be in, whether in participation as a participant or someone in opposition to it, or as someone
mhm,
in opposition to it. Um, this situation that we are in right now, where the old national projects have been essentially abandoned, the project of creating a better future has been abandoned.
mhm,
And all these national political cultures are now engaged with is bringing back the past in some form or other, make America great again, or make Russia great again, make India great again. um and I think the position of the writer becomes more and more complicated and more fraught in these circumstances.
mhm.
um I'd love to know what you think of this. There is I feel like there is at some places in your work, there is a sort of, assumption, of course, that uh, this kind of this kind of a faith in future was needed, and is important, is necessary.
You know, I think that to start talking about that, we need to discuss both the terms, faith and future, because I absolutely think that we have a crisis of thinking or of imagining when it comes to the future. Everyone talks about it, everyone says that we need to start thinking about the future and so on. But uh, it never happens in the context of desire. The future is a necessity, something you're being pushed into. You have to be born into the future. And I mean, who wants that? And it is interesting because I was doing that even before the pandemic. I was teaching here and there, and I was always asking in the class at the students to name a film, a blockbuster, a movie that would be important enough, engaging enough in terms of audience, in terms of impact, a film that would be portraying the future in as a positive perspective, or at least as something tolerable, bearable, a future that one would feel nice about. And it is interesting because in the US and in Europe uh, and in Russia, the students were reacting in the same way. They were hesitating. They could not point out a right title. And then someone was like, but of course, Back to the Future, which was filmed, the first movie was filmed in 1985.
That's right.
And for me, it is a watershed. That is the moment I could give you a couple of examples dealing with the Soviet culture, Soviet literature, but being brief, that's the moment when future stopped being a welcome perspective.
Mm.
The Soviet sci-fi writers who wrote the Strugatsky brothers wrote these beautiful utopias about glorious people of the next centuries living in the communist world and facing certain dangers, certain, um, well, metaphysical challenges. They change the voice, and the writing becomes, well, it morphs from utopian to dystopian.
Wow.
And something similar happens with the Western science fiction. And for the last 20 years, I mean, if the film is dealing with the future, it is always a catastrophe to face technological, political, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, and I cannot afford to be a conspirologist. It is boring. So I don't think that it was a decision. I don't think it was a trend, which is much more dangerous. Somehow, all the enormous machines of human imagination, the Hollywood, Bollywood, whatsoever, stopped producing a good future. So no wonder that we are heading back into some imaginary past on an enormous speed because we know the script. So it is not so easy to have faith in the future, to want the future, to, well, it is, well, Eros replaced with Thanatos, and one has to have a very specific taste to get engaged with that.
True. It was interesting, the for many people around the world, for a longest time, maybe until the late 80s,
Mhm,
future was something very clearly defined by the Soviet Union.
mhm,
And was, primarily a future materially defined, in terms of, better socioeconomic conditions, better lifestyles, more expansive, more luxurious, more materialistic on the whole. But it was very much a future connected to the fortunes of the Soviet Union, and as a sort of decent, humane alternative to the system of capitalism. At least that's what many people thought. They did not know about the realities of the Soviet system. Um, and I think with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, and it's interesting you should date that, disappearance of the future to the mid 80s. Um, it really for many people, and I count myself as one of those people, in India. I was in India at that time. The disappearance of the Soviet Union meant that there was no other future for us
mhm,
apart from what the United States was proposing uh, as a future, which was the present of the United States was going to be the future of the rest of humanity. So we were on suddenly jerked onto a different trajectory altogether, which was the trajectories, the destination that we were now all traveling towards was the modernity represented by the United States, which in a way was already the present for people living in America. So it was a very strange, disorientating, I suppose, experience for many of us. I think we're still not really fully recovered from it. And now, looking at what is happening in the United States, it's very clear that that future that was being proposed to us was another ideological delusion.
Mhm.
Um, so that's, but I've gone much further than I wanted to with this line of thought. But it seems to me that when we think about the future today, or when we think about there's a line in your essay that really stayed with me, and when I went back to it, I could see that I had sort of underlined it, and it says, "It's time to allow the past to become the past, to stop counting on its arsenal, to drown the magic books, and begin to expand, shake up, cultivate the territory of today, thinking of it as a place to live." And not the anteroom before the gas chamber. Really wonderfully eloquent expressions here. And they left me thinking about, yes, seizing the present moment, seizing where we are today, not letting despair overwhelm us, but conceiving of what we can do in the present, but wondering also whether we can do this without having a very clear conception of the future of the kind that the
Mhm.
Soviet Union and the United States offered us in the past.
That's the problem. And I suppose that the experience of the pandemic has seriously changed, uh, well, our faith or our devotion to the concept of living in the present. Because, well, it stopped being so tempting.
Mm.
It is not so easy. And yes, without having a clear version of the past and the future, it is unbearable. And yes, we are standing. Uh, I have this. mm, it is more of a feeling than a notion, but it haunts me for the last few years. I mean, we are still trying, but you you write about that in the Age of Anger, about the way um, many things we're experiencing now is a long echo of the long 18th century. And the lack of faith in the future, or the, let's say, perversion of faith that makes us replace the future with the past. I mean, it is an outcome of a secular mind palpitating the empty space of, of a possible vertical. And I wonder if the problem could be solved in a logical way. Because when you describe thinkers or activists or politicians um, that are choosing the religion of Thanatos, it is one more possible way of reacting. But nothing holds. And I suppose that that is the problem with uh, man made concepts. Uh, Nothing holds for a long time. Even the best inventions do not survive their lifetime, and then they transform into something quite horrifying.
Mm.
I don't
It
quite.
does.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I'm thinking one of the secular faiths, one of the secular religions of the last 150, 200 years has been literature. Um,
Yes. Mhm.
it's particularly strong, it has grown stronger, um, where people openly say that, it's literature that's going to save us.
Mhm.
And it's, by cultivating empathy, compassion, quite simple-minded notions about what literature is meant to do. But there is this faith which remains alive. And I think as writers, we are beneficiaries of that faith. People still look up to writers. People still think, there is something that literature has to offer. But we know that literature actually does not offer a paradigm or a blueprint for the
Mhm.
future. It has a completely, it doesn't really have a purpose of that kind. It doesn't have a social purpose of that kind. But as a practitioner
Mhm.
of literature, um, how do you see the future of literature itself, quite apart from those other futures that we've been discussing? I mean, I think one of the, I suppose, strange facts about literature under repressive regimes was that it still paradoxically had a dignity
Mhm.
and a kind of secret flourishing was allowed to it. I'm so struck by, and you describe in your book too, like everyone is reading, and everyone is kind of attracted to the idea of writing. There's a respect for authors. Um, there is a familiarity with literary traditions, and we now know it's all gone. It's all gone in very many different parts of the world, and in many others, it's going. Um, and I think I've often asked myself the question: well, this very interesting religion that emerged in the 19th century
Mhm.
and quickly became very popular amongst educated minorities around the world. What is its fate? Um,
Mhm.
what are we supposed to be doing now? We are obviously going to keep on doing what we're doing right now. Um, but one is still haunted by a sense of, well, very very rapidly growing marginality, and certainly when it's accompanied by physical exile or
Mhm.
physical dispossession, then that is a much stronger feeling. And you've just written a novel, actually, circling around those themes. I would love to know your thoughts about this.
You know, I was able to witness uh, the process of inflation or devaluation of literature and writers in the early post-Soviet times. And it was quite instructive because even if we know now that Stalin did not read Mandelstam, still the
You read
fact.
Pasternak.
Mhm. He read Pasternak, exactly, and Akhmatova. And Brodsky was writing his letters to Brezhnev with fully believing that Brezhnev is going to read the letters and to react in some way. And then in a couple of years, from let's say 1988 to 1992, the whole thing just disappeared. The print runs of literary magazines shrunk from millions to maybe a few thousand copies, which was normal for the outside world. Think of the print runs of the Criterion or well, even New Yorker. But still, no one was prepared for that. And for the next 30 years, literature was living in well, in certain scarcity, and the state or or people in power never bothered themselves with whatever was happening in the literary field. And I don't mean only poetry or experimental writing, novels, in a sense of a great American novel, great Russian novel, they were not that popular as well. Uh, and literature is retaining its dignity only now in the climate of catastrophe.
Mm.
But I have a feeling that it is something that happens with poetry all the time. And we can, I mean, with literature in general, it might be following the same lines. I mean, the average print run of a book of poetry, it is uh,
How much?
500 to maybe 1,000 if you're lucky.
Yeah.
And it is the same, was the same in any given country, in any given time. In Pushkin's times and in Paul Valéry's times, in Ahmad, I mean, that is the same. We have a limited audiences
True.
that are interested in poetry, and they don't change with the level of education. I mean, either you are into it or not. But when the catastrophe happens, something changes on a chemical level because poetry answers a question or it formulates a question that was not valid for the majority of reading audiences until a certain point. But then, for a few years, when we need the answer, when we need, well, something, some kind of appeal that allows us to endure the presence of sublime in the old Brooks sense, which is, I mean, practical and bearable. And I think that that is that's what literature does. And nowadays, with autofiction and all the hybrid essayistic genres that are not plot driven as much as the well, orthodox novel, uh, they help us, they instruct us, they show us the way of adjusting, not adjusting, of mm, opening ourselves to the circumstances. But what I wanted to ask you is your own feeling, your own approach to, well, my idea is that uh, nowadays cinema or maybe TV series are replacing literature uh, in the realm when it is well where it imitates religion. Do you feel that? Do you agree, or do you think that they are sharing the space or trying to push each other out?
I think that, I mean, what you've just said is really interesting. I mean, I think there is a special role for poetry. And,
Mhm,
you know, I have to remember that actually poetry is the major literary form
mhm,
in most countries. You know, I think the novel has an outsized presence only in a small part of the world, in places like India, for instance, and I can think of many other countries too. It's poetry, both written and performed, that has been the major art form.
mhm.
Um, it's not the narrative. It's not the narrative
Even now.
of the novel.
Uh-huh.
Not so it's sort of even to this day, I think poetry remains a very popular art form, and because of its easy distribution, easy dissemination, and circulations, novels require different kind of commitment, different kind of energy altogether. So they're much less popular as a result. Um, and I think having not written poetry, having chosen this art form that came to me via non Indian literature, mostly through Western literature. There were obviously Indian novelists that I read, Um, but now, of course, as you say, the narrative is being appropriated quite cleverly by the multi-episodic television series, where a certain kind of exploration of motivation or character is possible that wasn't really possible in a 2 hour long film or a 3 hour long film. And so people are often kind of turning away, or they often, one way of describing the new Netflix series is like, it's like a great novel.
Mhm.
Uh, that the experience of spending a lot of time with a particular narrative, getting immersed in it, in its characters, that's what it's sort of doing, explaining it. And hence, I suppose, the rise of autofiction, which is offering people something intellectually much more substantial and something that doesn't only have the charm of the narrative or the storytelling power of the narrative. It's an invitation to a different kind of experience, much more complex, much more, I suppose, interior than the sort of beguiling narrative or beguiling story. Um, but at the same time, I feel that, having no interest whatsoever in ever writing for film or TV, um, but also writing a great deal of nonfiction at the same time, I feel that I think the the turning away from narrative and into television, into the television series, that again sort of leaves us, the rest of us, quite bereft. So I think it's another kind of challenge that you now have to face, which is that the sort of, not all of us can write autofiction. It's a particular kind of talent. It's a particular sort of skill that is required there, and not many people are most novelists are not capable of it. And I think they still want to produce narratives. I'm not sure if I'm one of them, but I still find the the surrender of the traditional ground of the narrative to television and to these other digital forms has been a loss. Um, and I'm not sure whether we'll recover from it. It's becoming more and more difficult for people to read. This is a commonplace now, to read longer novels, especially older novels, whether it's Middlemarch or War and Peace. So I think it's sort of, it's hard to deny that there are these losses there. So hence my sort of question about being practitioners of of or the devout amongst fading religion, which is an interesting fate. But as you say, I mean, I think you know it was always a minority art form, and I think perhaps a greater minority, a smaller minority rather, than we've seen in the past. But anyway, it's such a real pleasure to talk to you, Maria. And I'm so delighted, really, that you'll be with us for another few months and participating in all these other things that we'll be doing as Georgetown Global Dialogue Fellows. So much more to talk about. There's so many things in this conversation we've just had that I want to follow up on, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity in next few months and certainly in October in Indonesia. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. And it is good to know that we've just started. So I am looking forward to all the conversations to follow into October, of course.
Terrific. Thanks again, Maria.